All right, church family, go ahead and open your Bibles to Luke chapter 19 as Lane just instructed. And I want to tell you or prepare you, the sermon will lead right into our time of communion, of celebrating the Lord's Supper. So go ahead, if you haven't yet, I want to give you permission to go ahead and get up and sneak to the back and grab some of the elements there. In the meantime, turn to Luke chapter 19, or if you're using a pew Bible, that's on page 878. One of the most significant themes in the book of Luke is the theme of peace. And you remember this. In some of the opening lines in the book, we hear Zechariah say to his son, some of the first script, some of the first words that are spoken in the book of Luke. Zechariah says to his son John, who will become one day John the Baptist, he says, "You will give light to those who are in darkness, and you will guide our feet in the way of peace." And then, just in the next scene, moments later, it seems, there in the heavens, there's this huge choir of angels bursting out in a song, singing, "Glory to God in the highest." And on earth, what? Peace. To whom, upon whom his favor rests. And then, if you go all the way back to the back of the book, the very last conversation that Luke records in his Gospel of Luke, Jesus opens that conversation with these words, "Peace be to you." And then he goes on to describe, I give you my peace. Peace is such an integral theme throughout the book of Luke. Luke is so intent on telling, I would even say telling the story of peace. Peace come to earth, where peace comes from. But at the same time then, we would say, okay, so here we are, 2,000 years later, and we would say, peace? Really? Like, if that's the case, if peace came to earth, and if God proclaimed peace on earth, my peace I live with you, and yet if peace is something that it seems like no generation has ever gotten a handle on, right? Like 2022 or our generation will be known for a lot of things. It will not be known as a generation of peace, I don't think, right? So then we would say, well, then is Christianity even legitimate? Like, is this message having any positive effect? Does it work? Is it getting through? What kind of peace is he even talking about? What does that peace actually look like? What we see here in this passage in Luke 19, it's this wonderful passage that's filled with all these paradoxes and ironies, because one of the things that you're going to see is this inbreaking peace, and at the very same time, it's in the setting of Jesus kicking the hornet's nest and setting Jerusalem all abuzz in the very same moments. And you're going to see the why, the truth, the reason for peace in the midst of what seems like increasing chaos. And in the passage we're about to read, there's a key statement right in the heart of it. Actually, get your eyes to verse 42. Just look at verse 42. Luke 19, verse 42. The entire passage kind of hangs on this phrase, where Jesus himself, in this very passionate moment, says, "Would that you, even you, like I wish that you had known on this day the things that make for peace." The things that make for peace. Well, what are those things that make for peace? Here in Luke 19, Jesus answers that. He answers that in some of what he says. He answers that in what he does. And he points not to a what, but actually to a who. And in these moments, he proves, he goes on to prove, and we're going to see this, he proves that he, Jesus, is everything that leads to peace. So I want to take you through these three sections, and I want to remind you of a phrase that many of you have probably heard multiple times throughout your life if you've been a part of the church or around the church culture for any length of time. It's this threefold phrase of prophet, priest, and can you finish the last one? What's the last one? King. Yeah, prophet, priest, and king. Say that out loud with me. Prophet, priest, and king. And one of the things that you note, one of the things that stood off the page to me when I was studying this past week, is those three offices of our Savior come to the front and are at play all at once in this scene here at the end of Luke chapter 19. And so what I think Luke is showing us is that Jesus is this prophet, priest, and king. But we're not going to take them in that order because that's not the order that the passage goes in. So let's look first. He, Jesus, is everything that leads to peace. He is, number one, he is the king to whom we must submit. The king to whom we must submit. Look at this. Verse 28. Let's begin reading the passage together, and we'll comment along the way. Verse 28 says, "And when he had said these things, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. And when he drew near to Bethphage and Bethany, at the mount that is called Olivet, he sent two of the disciples." Let me pause for just a moment and let me explain some of the context here. So he's coming from Jericho. That's in the east, right? He's coming from Jericho, which is 850 feet below sea level, and he's climbing now to Jerusalem, which is 2,500 feet above sea level. So he's just constantly going up and up and up, climbing his way, making his way up to Jerusalem. Now, Jerusalem, and some of us have had the privilege of being there. Jerusalem is the city that's on a hill, right? It's a city on a mountaintop, and it's a mountain, right? Because if you think of Jerusalem being 2,500 feet up, in perspective, here's a little perspective. If you go to the Delaware Water Gap, the highest mountain there, I think it's Mount Tammany in the Delaware Water Gap, is 1,500 feet. So Jerusalem is 1,000 feet higher than the closest mountain to us here in PA. And Jesus has been walking this the entire way, right? From Jericho. It's about an 18-mile trip. He probably made this all in one shot, all in one day. And this is probably the end of that long day for him. And he gets near to Bethphage and Bethany, which is the mountain or the peak just to the east of Jerusalem. And it actually, the Mount of Olives was one of Jesus' favorite spots. He would go to that spot often to pray. He would go to that spot. In fact, one of his best friends, Lazarus, and Mary and Martha lived in Bethany on that mountain, and he would go to the Mount of Olives a lot to look and to view. It was his favorite view of Jerusalem, the holy city, Zion. And so, picture this then. Jesus is coming up from the backside, from Jericho, up this mountain, coming, if it were, and this is how Chris Edwards and I were talking about this passage this past week, and he described it like this. He said it's as if Jesus was like this laser-guided missile where he was sent to earth, right? And his entire ministry has been focused on Israel. And then he, for the beginning of his ministry, began in Capernaum and now is making his way to Jerusalem. And from Jerusalem, when he gets to Jerusalem, the very first thing he's going to do is head right to the temple. And so it's like this entire focal point of his ministry is coming down to this moment to which he's been sent. And this temple being the hot spot representing the presence of God on earth with men. And here it is coming to a head, right? And so Bethany, Bethphage, they're there on that mountain. If you're there, you can see from that mountaintop, there's this valley called the Kidron Valley, and then it climbs back up to the city of David and Jerusalem and the temple on top. So he's close, right? But notice this, if you just glance your eyes at the text, notice this. People have marveled at this. Luke is about to spend a lot of time talking about the process of getting a donkey. And if you think about the real estate that Luke uses to describe what's happening next, about this little donkey, this colt, this foal of a donkey, he spends more time on this than he does, just look at down below. He spends more time on this than he does on clearing the temple. He spends more time on this than he does on this great prophecy that he's going to give about something pretty heavy that's coming Israel's way. One of my questions would be, well, why? Why? This seems so random. Why does he do this? Read verse 29. "And when he drew near to Bethphage and Bethany, at the mount that is called Olivet, he sent two of his disciples, saying, Go into the village in front of you, where on entering you will find a colt tied, on which no one has ever yet sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks you, 'Why are you untying it?' you shall say this, 'The Lord has need of it.'" So, verse 32, now he starts to repeat things almost word for word. "So, those who were sent went away and found it just as he had told them. And as they were untying the colt, its owners said to them, 'Why are you untying the colt?' And they said, 'The Lord has need of it.'" So what's this about? What is Luke doing? He's beginning to prove, and I'll make this case, he's beginning to prove, and we're going to see even more in just a moment, he's beginning to prove that Jesus is king. That he is the ultimate king. Luke doesn't waste words, right? Why does he repeat what Jesus said will happen with what did happen, almost word for word? This seems like a silly detail, but it's not. I mean, here, he's proving, he knew that there would be a colt. He knew that it would be tied up. He knew where it would be, right? And he knew what it would take to get that colt back to himself, what had to be said, right? And he knew all of this stuff. And he was making it very clear. I think Luke is making it very clear that Jesus is in control at this moment. He is writing the script. And some would say, well, maybe he knew. Maybe he had this prearrangement. It's not the first time that he had been to Jerusalem. It's not the first time he had been to Bethany. It's very possible that he had arranged something ahead of time. I think it's pretty unlikely that he would have come from Jericho with that kind of detail already arranged. And even if it was arranged, it proves Jesus is writing the script. Jesus is in complete control over the events leading up to his death. And he's showing that the disciples are learning to do what he says, right? Like think of these moments that Jesus, think of these little snapshots of the life of Christ and the disciples that had happened just in the last couple of years. Think of passages that we've studied before together here. I think it was back in Luke chapter 5, where Jesus tells Peter, hey, go ahead and cast your nets into the deep. Here we are in the hottest time of day. Fishermen don't fish during the day, they fish at night. Here we are in the middle of the lake. They don't fish in the middle of the lake, they fish by the shore, where the fish come in from the streams. Cast your nets into the deep. And these seemingly exasperated disciples say, okay, Lord. And what do? They cast their nets and they pull up this gigantic catch of fish. Or think of another moment where Jesus, on another occasion, Jesus says, hey, go ahead and go catch a fish. And then take that fish, pry open its jaw, and inside you're going to find a coin that's going to be enough to pay the temple tax for both you and for me. Super quirky instructions. They go and do it, and sure enough, it comes true, right? So the disciples are learning. When Jesus says to do even these strange things, I want to do it. And they did it, and it worked, right? And he's showing that there's peace and order when we submit and do what he says, when we fulfill his will, when we do what we are told. Now, let me pause and just say this, because if you're not a Christian and you're hearing this, I can imagine maybe even some inner defenses might be going up right now, because you're thinking, okay, yeah, like this is exactly what I would expect from some religion, right? Yeah, just do what you're told. Just shut up and obey. That's what you're supposed to do. That's what religion tells you. That's what every religion tells you, right? But and if that's the case, like if you're thinking that, I would say, yeah, that would make sense. That it would seem like this is what's going on in this passage. Take my freedom away, right? But watch the beauty of what happens next. It's not as like usury as you think. Watch the beauty of what happens next. Verse 35, it says, and they brought the colt, they brought it to Jesus, and throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. And as he rode along, they spread their cloaks on the road. So there's cloaks on the colt, there's cloaks on there, there's cloaks everywhere. Now, and a donkey, you're thinking that you're looking at this scene, right? And you think a donkey doesn't seem very regal, right? But this is richly symbolic for the Jewish people. for Israel, this has always been a symbol of royalty. If you go all the way back to 1 Kings chapter 1, where David was about to pass on his throne, what he did was he instructed people, go get Solomon and put him on my donkey and take him through the town and sing over him. And ever since then, this has been a rich symbol of royalty coming into a city in peace, right? And so Luke is making this case. There's something rich, something royal going on here. Verse 37. As he was drawing near, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, so you can picture this, coming down into the Kidron Valley, already on the way down the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of his disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works that they had seen. So these are people that had been with Jesus for a long time. They've been tracking with him. They've been watching him. They've been seeing him cast out demons and heal the blind and heal lepers and change cities like Jericho, freeing them from the bondage of usury and tax misappropriation. So they've seen all these mighty works that had been seen. Verse 38, saying, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest, right? So there's our theme. Again, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. Why? Because this King has come. Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. So again, Luke is making this point. This is what leads to peace. Jesus is the ultimate King, meaning centuries and centuries of anticipation and preparation have built and built and built upon one another until finally, right, at long last, all that has been is now perfected and realized in him. He is the ultimate King. And we use this word, I use this word ultimate, but our culture has destroyed, we've totally lost sight of that word. When we think of ultimate, I just heard the term ultimate bean burrito from Taco Bell. Like that, like it's, we've made comic this term. The ultimate, the arch nemesis of Superman's ultimate enemy. When we say ultimate, I mean it in the truest, literary sense. He, Jesus, is the final fulfillment of all that we've been waiting for. All that Israel's been waiting for. It's in him. This King that they've been yearning for is in him. And how do we see this? How do we know this? First, in this very moment, they're fulfilling the words of Zechariah 9:9, this prophecy that's been spoken and would be ringing in their ears, where he says, behold, Zechariah says, behold, your King is coming to you, righteous and having salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Can you imagine the thrill of this moment when they physically pick up Jesus? Who picks up Jesus? They actually picked up Jesus and put him on this donkey and started leading him down this road to Jerusalem, which, by the way, means city of peace. And they're singing these praises. And they're quoting from Psalm 118, right? This psalm that was sung it was this parade of victory, right? Where this king would be leading, and we don't know which king. It was probably sung multiple times after multiple victories, where they would sing this psalm as they would head into the holy city. And they would sing these words, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is this King who led us to victory, who saved us from defeat. Blessed is he because he brings salvation. And they're singing these words over Jesus, right? And you can imagine imagine that moment and the power of that moment. And you'd think, this is it, right? Surely they see it. But not everybody sees it. Verse 39. Some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, teacher, not Lord, definitely not king, but teacher, rebuke your disciples. And he answered them, I tell you, if these were silent, the very stones would cry out. All of the kings have led up to this one. All of the saving moments have led up to this one. All of the people should be following this one. And here the Pharisees have proven some of them, and some important ones, still refuse to believe. But don't miss this. Here's another element that points to his kingship, an element that I think is kind of embedded into this text that a lot of us miss. If you notice, do you notice what's happening between him, not just him and the people that are surrounding him, but him and nature, him and creation in this moment that he captures or he alludes to in this text when he says, I tell you, if these were silent, if these disciples, if these human beings were silent, then the very stones would cry out. What is it? Nature itself will cry out. On the one hand, you could say inanimate objects have a better grasp on what God is doing sometimes than the people that he came to save. Or you could say creation is aware of Jesus, even though the leadership of the nation is not. But on the other hand, you could say nature stands always ready to serve the Creator, at the ready to proclaim God's glory. Jesus is tapping into this rich eschatological truth that Scripture talks about all along. I mean, I think of Isaiah chapter 55, where we hear, you shall be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you will break forth in singing, and the trees of the hills will clap their hands, right? Can you imagine? Someday, I believe this is going to come true, where we're going to be singing God's praises, and nature is going to be right there behind us, the torrent of the wind singing his praises over us. But here, we see this. Creation submits to this king's authority. We're going to get a taste of that someday. But think of how this is pictured in this text. Not just in the creation and the stones, but go back to this little donkey. I think Luke wants us to talk about the donkey. He spent a lot of time on it. So this tiny, young colt of a donkey. Think about this. If you had to choose, if you had to ride an animal of your choice, say right into Times Square on New Year's Eve, if you had to choose an animal, what would you choose? You've got this raucous crowd of noisy people screaming in your face, waving palm branches, the other Gospels tell us, throwing cloaks. What kind of animal would you choose? I'm pretty sure you would not choose a young animal that's never been tamed, never been broken, never been ridden, just taken away from its mother, we read from the other Gospels, right? I'm pretty sure, I would venture to guess that's not the animal that you would think, that's it, that's my choice, that's my ride, right there. But Jesus, this colt, this unbroken colt, under the hand of the Creator, was calm under the King. I think it's one more layer that Luke is adding that shows Jesus' kingship in this moment. I mean, do you know why animals run from you and are scared of you? It's because they're smart, right? They know that we don't always have their best interest in mind as humanity. But Jesus closes that gap. And even in this moment, he brings this out. He brings out this dynamic that he is Lord of the creation, even in his comments about how the stones themselves would do his bidding and sing his praise. He is the king to whom we must submit. So now, why is this important? Why is this so crucial for us to understand? Why would this be, or why could this be life transforming? It's this. We don't like the idea of having a king over us. We don't like the idea of having to submit. We don't like the idea that somebody else might actually control our life or rule our life, right? But when Jesus is in charge, when Jesus says, go and do this, and we do it, when Jesus is on top, if you think of the cult, when he takes over, he doesn't break you, he fulfills you. And he answers that, that anxiety that rears up in us as autonomous individuals, as reasonable individuals who appreciate our autonomy and our freedom, who see rule and reign over us as a threat to our autonomy. He answers that, even in this moment, by showing, when I enter, when I take over, when I come into a life, I don't enslave, I don't break, I fulfill, and I make beautiful, and I bring order, and I bring peace. But you must submit to his loving rule. Just a couple of days ago, I was sitting with Bill Schmidt, talking about a couple of moments that Bill has had the privilege of experiencing where he's seen in real time a horse, you called him a horse whisperer, tame a wild horse, where the horse was brought onto this platform, into the center of an audience. A horse that had never been ridden, a horse that had never been broken. And at one point, one of the horses was even bucking and rearing, right? And they had it hemmed in with a fence, I think. And the horse whisperer even said at one point, I'm going to get on this thing in the next few minutes. I'm going to show you just how badly this animal will fight because he thinks that what he wants is freedom and autonomy. But I know, and you know, that what he needs is a loving hand, a loving owner, a loving master to come and to show him that life can be better when you are provided for, when you are cared for, when you are taught, when you are trained, when you are broken. And in a sense, that's exactly what's happening in this moment with Jesus and this tiny little cult that's heading into this crazy crowd, totally at peace. So Jesus is everything that leads to peace. He is the king to whom we must submit. Number two, and again, these are out of order, but in number two, they're in order in the text. He is the prophet to whom we must listen. Look how Luke brings this out, that he is the prophet to whom we must listen. In verse 41, he says, "And when he drew near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, 'Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace. But now they are hidden from your eyes.'" I knew it was going to get me. That he wept, right? See, I weep too. You can't make fun of me. Our Savior weeps, and he can't control it. And in these moments, it just hits you. I don't write, by the way, you know this. I don't write into my script, "Cry here, Tim." And he didn't either, right? Yes, he wrote the script. No, he didn't. I really believe he came over the crest of that hill, and he laid eyes on this city. He's been making this journey since Luke chapter 9, verse 51. He left Capernaum on his way to Jerusalem for this moment, right? For this very week. And his whole heart was in this. And he comes over the crest of this hill and he lays eyes on this city, this city that represents God's people, this city that housed his temple, this city that represents the presence of God on earth with men, this city that has rejected him. These people that have said, "No thanks, God. We don't actually want you." And he sees these people, and he sees this city, and he cries, right? Like that would be his first reaction. Not anger, not bitterness, not vitriol. He could have been frustrated. He could have called down fire from heaven. He could have done all. No, what he does is he cries. This is the thing that's closest to his heart, right? Slow to anger. abounding in loving kindness. And out of compassion, he weeps. Tears are flowing down his face as he's looking at his people, knowing what he's about to say to them about what's coming, knowing what's coming in just a week from now. Right? This is his Jeremiah-like prophetic heart. Friends, I mean, you think if you're going to listen to somebody, if you're going to listen to someone who has the right to tell you what to do, who has the right to tell you who you are, and to define for you your identity and your purpose in life, if you're going to listen to somebody, doesn't it help your heart to know that he loves you? And that he's for you, that he has your best interest in mind, right? That he weeps over you. And here he is, that he loves you like this. Listen to these words. Listen to these words of the ultimate prophet. Verse 43, it says, "For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you, Jerusalem, and your children within you. And they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." So we know now, because we can look back at history, we know now that Jesus is being very specific in this prophecy about the year 70 AD, when Rome would surround and destroy Jerusalem and tear down this beautiful temple, tear down this city, set it ablaze, and literally, physically dismantle the temple. You wonder, when you read this passage, you wonder, what would have happened had they listened to Jesus in this, what he calls your time of visitation. And when you hear that word, by the way, that's kind of like a hyperlink to the Christian who reads their Bible. You go back to Exodus, when Moses was confronted by God through that burning bush, and he goes to God's people and says, "Hey, I've been sent by him," and he shows them these signs with his staff, and they burst out in song and praise, saying, "Our God has visited us." God has visited his people, meaning God's up to something. There's this massive redemptive event. It's happening in our time. We don't want to miss it. We feel God's presence. He's up to something. And Jesus is saying, this is your time of visitation, and you missed it. You wonder what would have happened to the temple had they listened. The veil would have been gone, right? Because we already knew that was going to be taken care of. Presence would have been free and open access to all. But because he couldn't dismantle this temple spiritually through his teaching only, he had to dismantle it physically, because it's no longer necessary after this week. And here's the point. When people listen to God's voice, there's peace and restoration to God. When people didn't listen to God's voice, there was judgment from God. So, if he's the king, and if he's the prophet, what's coming next? He is the what? He's the priest. Right, so Jesus is everything that leads to peace. He's the king to whom we must submit. He's the prophet to whom we must listen. And lastly, he's the priest whom we must trust. And verse 45 says, "And he entered the temple." So he did it. He went from Israel to Capernaum to Jerusalem to the temple. He entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be a house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of robbers." Let me pause here and say the temple courts were filled with vendors selling things that were actually needed for worship, right? Some people think that the point is that they shouldn't have even been there in the first place. That's not the point. They were actually necessary for worship to happen. Animals, wine, salt, oil, doves, of birds of different kinds, all of those things were necessary for the temple worship to happen. So he didn't need to kick them out because they weren't supposed to be there. What it was that there were two levels to this, two layers to this. On one hand, They had taken this necessary element of worship and had monetized it for their own financial gain. The priesthood was supposed to operate off of the free will offerings of God's people. But instead they said, okay, we're going to put a little tax on top of this. And when you have to use this certain coin, only this one coin can be used for the temple tax, and we're going to charge you to change your money into that coinage. And so we're going to make money off of that. So they were making money left and right. They had created a racket out of worship. And that's why Jesus called them robbers. But there's another level. There's another layer, right? Because what's interesting is that he drove them out. When you drive out the vendors, you drive out the animals also, right? You drive out the sacrifices also. He didn't correct them and let them stay. He removed them. Mark 11:16 actually notes that Jesus refused to let any of them back into the temple. And instead, all week, what happens? Look at verse 47. It says, and he was teaching daily in the temple. So what does Jesus do? What does he put in the place of these sacrifices? He stands there himself in this courtyard. And he stays there and he teaches. And we're going to see day after day for the rest of the week, his powerful presence occupied that courtyard. And swarms of crowds surrounded him, hanging on his words day after day, every day, out in the open. And things are going to get more and more intense. In other words, he wasn't reforming the system. He was replacing the system. He is the priest. He is the sacrifice. And now, did he get his message across? That's one of the questions that we would have to ask. Was he clear? And how would we know? Look at verse 47. It says, and he was teaching daily in the temple. And listen, the chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people were seeking to destroy him, to kill him, in other words. But they did not find anything that they could do, for all the people were hanging on his words. So in other words, Jesus is forcing their hand. He's making them face his claims. No longer could they hope that his 15 minutes of fame would be over, right? No longer could they hope that it would just be this passing thing, this little phase, this trend or whatever, and that he would just move on. He's making a claim, and he's making a stand so big and so bold that there would only be two possible outcomes. And he basically says this: you have to either king me or kill me. I'm not going anywhere. I'm planting myself right here, right in the heart of the temple. You have two options. Either you embrace me or you get rid of me. Either you king me or you crown me. I just came in as the rightful king. Will you take me, yes or no? Friends, when we think of him as our ultimate king, our ultimate prophet, and our ultimate priest, he is the very thing that leads to peace. He is the very thing, the very one who leads to peace with God, our Creator. And the question for you is, will you king him or will you crown him? He says, right? He says basically, I am the ultimate prophet, priest, king. One thing I will not accept is indifference. You can't just have me on the side of your life. You can't just enjoy me on the weekends on Sunday. If I know whether or not you've gotten my message, right? If you king me or kill me, at least you've heard me. But too many of us have this relationship with him where we just like to keep him. Not to kill him, but not necessarily either to king him in our life. We just like to keep him there, keep him in this certain spot, keep him on this certain shelf. We're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. In fact, I want to ask the worship team to come on up and to join me up here. And we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. And I want this to be our driving focus this morning as we prepare our hearts for this celebration. If you're here this morning and you've never considered the claims of Christianity, then I want you to just watch, just observe. The Bible actually says in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul is writing about communion, and he says, listen, some of you are getting sick, some of you are even dying because you're eating and drinking judgment upon yourself. If you're not examining your own hearts, if you're not right with the Lord, if you haven't made peace with this prophet, priest, and king, don't eat this, because then you're eating judgment upon yourself. If you're here this morning and you can't claim that Jesus is king, then don't eat this. Just watch. But I would love for you to participate in this the next time we celebrate. So come and talk to me afterward, or talk to one of the pastors or one of your elders. We would love to explain and share and help you and introduce you to this king. But friends, if you're here this morning, let me apply this way. It was at the end of this very week that a lamb would be slain. In fact, Flavius Josephus, the historian, said that somewhere close to 250,000 lambs would be slain in Jerusalem each year. That's 250,000 households. So probably upwards of 1 million or 2 million people in this city at this time. It was at the end of this week that a lamb would be slain for you. And that blood would cover you if you put your trust in that lamb. And Jesus celebrated Passover on the night that he was betrayed. He took the bread around that table and he broke it and he fulfilled it, and he said, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Eat this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, he took the cup after supper, which was the cup of the covenant. And he said, "This cup is my blood, the new covenant. Drink this in remembrance of me." And Paul reminds us that every time we eat this bread, and every time we drink this cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And it's because he was our prophet, our king, our perfect priest. It's because he was the sacrifice. It's because he made a way that we can have peace with God. And that is a peace that is invulnerable. That is a peace that is invincible. And that is a peace that can reside within you and within me when this world is going crazy, since this world is going crazy. That is a peace that is untouchable. And that is a peace that Jesus could say, "My peace I give to you." Let's continue to worship together as we sing in Christ alone.